Hi, and welcome back to David Pattinson's Accused Friends. Today I want to have a conversation about exactly what are the limits to government authority throughout this health crisis, where the government's totally steamrolled British civil liberties and are taking on more and more authority. I think it's a great time to sort of pause and really ask this question. People have been so shocked at all the civil liberties being violated left and right, and I think that they've been so shell-shocked. It's been a bit of a length of time before we can even, come up for air and really ask this question in a detailed way. And I'm no constitutional lawyer. I note that the silence of all our constitutional experts has been totally deafening through this crisis, but I have jotted down some notes that I think are pertinent. Some of them are limits to government authority, and some of them are ideas that I want us to start talking about and thinking about as a country. I also think that now's an appropriate time to go through all of these and want to share some insights. So if you ask Boris Johnson, what are the limits to government authority? He'd probably say something like, there are no limits. We just do exactly what we want. We're not constrained by anything. If you were to ask Rishi, Rishi, how much is too much? How much spending can you do before you run out of money? He'd probably say something like, we never think about that. We just spend with abandon. And if you asked Hancock the same question, he'd probably just say, how dare you question me? And, this is the attitude of the government. They don't give a damn about civil liberties. They don't think about any constraints on power. So I wanted to go through some points, and that's the number one purpose of the government, of all our elected officials, is to defend the rights and freedoms of the British people. That's their sole purpose for being in Parliament and being in government. And I think if you ask any of our MPs that, they'd be kind of shocked to know. I remember when David Cameron came to Downing Street and, he had no idea that we had an English Bill of Rights. And a lot of people were shocked that he didn't know this. But by the time he left Downing Street, everyone realised that it was obvious that he didn't know that. He wasn't making it up to start with. So rights and freedoms, number one on my list. The second point I want to make for people that don't know, and that is that civil liberties are valid at all times, no exceptions. A lot of these great constitutional documents are set up in times of crisis. Magna Carta was, and the English Bill of Rights was set up during a revolutionary period. And there's never any mention in these documents of exceptions for things like plagues, pandemics, coronaviruses, wars. They never mention that. And that's because the civil liberties are valid all the time, and they are most important at times of crisis. Freedom of speech, for example. No one worries about freedom of speech when you're wishing someone a happy birthday. They worry about it when you're talking about controversial things. And, the same with unlawful detention. People don't, worry about that if you're just pulling someone out of a bit of a scrap in a rugby match. But they worry about it when a whole country's under mass house arrest and, their freedom of movement is violated. So civil liberties apply all the time. Crucial point. This next point I've got a purpose of government, really, and that's to defend our borders. A key part of government work is to defend our country from foreign invasion, from foreign intruders, and it's amazing how little time our government spends on doing that for our country. They have a total open borders policy. They've had it for about the last 20 to 25 years. I think it's a total disgrace. And, if the government want to do something valuable with their time, defending our borders should be very high on our list. The next limit to government authority is that it cannot compel behaviour. It cannot force people to do things. And that specifically applies through this health crisis with compelling people to go into their home. You can't force people to go into their home and stay in their home. And I made a point a couple of weeks ago about how as we get out of lockdown, a lot of the government's going to be saying, hey, well, we're not going to force people back to work, or we're not going to force people back to school, or we're not going to force people back into society. But yet we did force them into their home. We did force them out of their schools. We did force them out of their companies. Excuse me. So why are we going to say, okay, well, it's okay to force us to do one thing, compel us to do one thing, but it's not okay to compel us to do another thing? And the limit to government authority is that we cannot compel behaviour at all. An individual can stay in bed their whole life. They do not have to be forced to do anything, and that's a total privilege of being a free citizen, something that the government really don't understand. The British Parliament can create or end laws. That is a part of the government authority, and I've got no problem with that. Something I would like to mention here is that we need to have, first of all, an end to the parliamentary assessment boards for political parties, where they're vetting candidates themselves to send to the people to vote for in a general election. I'm a big advocate of the primary process, where, for example, the Labour Party would have multiple Labour candidates standing against each other. Labour voters would vote on who they want to send to the general election. And, when they choose that candidate, that'll go up against the other parties in the general election. The decision on who the candidate is will not be made in Westminster by the party leadership itself. And the other thing we need to have is a total recall provision on members of parliament who, violate their authority and do not defend the rights of the British people. And this was particularly pertinent last year with these members of parliament switching parties during the Brexit debate. Whichever party all of a sudden had changed their position on Brexit, people from other parties would just be switching. And I think there was some sort of lady in Cambridge member of parliament who'd switched sort of parties 3 or 4 times, and I think held the record for switching parties. There's no place for switching parties from our elected officials, because your promise to the people is that you're representing their wishes, and if they wish for a certain party and they choose you, you have a legal obligation to remain with that party and represent their rights. So anyone who wants to switch parties, they can just be kicked out of parliament immediately and never return. I do want to make an additional point here about our English Bill of Rights and our Magna Carta, and that it needs to be, I think we're at a point now where it really needs to be updated. An easy argument against the Bill of Rights is that, look, David, this was back in the 17th century. It's kind of out of date. It doesn't really apply to modern life. But it totally applies to modern life. There's not been any referendum or vote by the people to say that it is not applicable. But I do think it needs to be updated and strengthened and reinforced. I lived in the United States for a lot of years. Something that's great about America is they are very, very aware of their Bill of Rights, and they talk about it all the time. And in our country, we hardly ever talk about our Bill of Rights, even though the American version is almost totally based on ours. So I think we need a big sort of civil education or a widespread national education program on our Bill of Rights, what it is, what it entitles us to do, and what it entitles the government to not do. And, I think if we could really emphasize this significantly in our public discourse, these lockdown scenarios would never be thought of, let alone become commonplace. Next limit to government authority is that I think that's something that needs to be emphasized, is that we the people grant powers to the government. The government does not grant freedoms to the people. And there's been a lot of discussion through this lockdown about, we're just waiting for Boris Johnson to give us some of our freedoms back. But we already have our freedoms. It's the government that have taken them away against the authority that the government have. It's those people that are in violation of the law. It is not the British people. And I don't think the government understand that. And I do think the British people need to speak up more and more, like I'm doing, and like a lot of people are doing. And that point needs to be absolutely hammered home, because, members of parliament, they got very selective memories. It's something they forget very easily. Another thing about civil liberties and our rights is that our rights are permissions to take action. They are not rights to receive goods and services. A lot of these political activists say things like, healthcare is a right, and abortion is a right, and social services are a right, and welfare is a right, and all this sort of stuff. And they're not. Permissions to take action are not correlated with the receiving of goods and services. And it's a sleight of hand. It's just like a political trick, activists use. And I think the people of our country need to be much more on top of clarifying, that rights are our ability to exercise our freedoms. They are not, an income redistribution program. They are not a welfare program. And, they're things that are totally different. Next point I've got here is that the government is subject to the same laws that you and I are subject to. The government cannot break the law. The government needs to be, is as accountable to the law as you and I are. And unfortunately, the government is so big and difficult to prosecute for violations of the law that it allows more lawlessness. And I think we need to have a lot more citizens groups that are focused on prosecuting the government for violations of the law. I'm dealing with it on the Alison Saunders front, someone who's totally violated the law, by enacting malicious prosecutions against British men. But there's lots of other abuses of the law through this lockdown, and Simon Dolan is dealing with a big one with the with his court case that I've talked about a lot, and there's lots of other government violations of the law that need to be monitored and prosecuted and disincentivized. And I'd like to see more of that happen. Something I'd like to challenge next is the government's right of taxation. Taxation first came into Britain in 1799, only for a very brief period of time, just a few years, and then it came back kind of in 1907, and it's sort of grown and grown. And a lot of the British people think that tax is something the government has a right to do, and I strongly question its right to tax income, because I argue that income is personal property. Government cannot seize or violate personal property, and I challenge the legality of income tax, and I think we need to get rid of it. People will say, well, David, how can the government pay its bills? How can they pay off all Rish's debt with no income tax? And 2 points I want to make there is I don't have a problem with the government taxing sales, and I don't have a problem with the government taxing imports, but income is personal property, and there's no freedom like economic freedom. And when the government's seizing so much of individuals' wealth, it distorts this relationship between people and state. And I think we need to, if we get rid of income tax, people have the right to control their own money and their own life, and government would shrink dramatically, and it would really realign this power imbalance between government and the people, and it would starve them of their wealth that is, they don't have a legal right to it, in my view, even though a lot of people think a lot of their money comes from the government. All of it comes from the British people through taxation. Okay, next point here. Just a second point on that is the manipulated interest rates. There's a lot of talk about how the Bank of England have the right to control interest rates. I want to have a market interest rate at all times. I do not want financial institutions and central banks manipulating interest rates and distorting the economy. We need to have an economy that is that allows creative destruction, it allows growth and profits, but it allows, crashes and bankruptcies, so we don't have, malinvestment and inefficient or misallocation of resources. And I think as long as the Bank of England can manipulate the interest rate, it perpetuates these sort of economic problems that we have. Now, there's a lot of people in the government would argue, hey, David, well, Bank of England's totally independent of the government, but, they're not. They're like, 1 mile away. There's Westminster, and then you go up the water, and then there's Bank of England, and a lot of these people intermingle socially and professionally and through the media, and I think more and more the bank's decisions are governed by government policy and dictated to by government policy, and we need to go back to a market interest rate at all times. The bank might argue that we always have that, but I doubt it highly. And I think just to point on all these bailouts, again, totally unlawful. The government does not have and should not have a right to lend money. It can borrow money, that's fine with me, it can borrow it from the people, but it cannot lend money, again, because it distorts the market. If a business venture or public venture is a viable venture, banks will lend, private citizens will lend, at an interest rate they agree with, or all agree with. But when the government starts getting involved saying, hey, well, this business may not be viable, but we're going to lend to it because it's politically expedient for us, it distorts the market, and it violates, citizens' rights who are on the losing end of that deal. So the concept of British rights is all predicated on equal rights. Everyone has the right to be treated equally under the law. I'm a big believer in the right to life. Obviously, the right to vote is something we have, and participate in free and fair elections. I believe every British citizen has a right to earn a living, and the right to own property is very important, and a great way to build wealth, obviously, through owning property. I want to finish on the rights violated during the lockdown by the government as I see it. And I've done a couple of videos on this, why British civil liberties are more important than ever, and put a link in the description. But specific citizens' rights voted during this lockdown, starting with freedom of speech. There's been a lot of censorship through online companies and online platforms with regard to people questioning, the death rates of the coronavirus, and the extent of the problem, and how we're locking up all these people, but deaths are really low. And this digital bill of rights is something we really need. We don't want to be beholden to American tech companies for our free speech rights. British people have the right to freedom of speech. They have the right to communicate with each other at any time, and to have a filter in a foreign country getting in the way of that and saying what we can and can't communicate with each other is totally wrong. It's totally unlawful, and it's amazing how the government, British government, cheer along the censors rather than standing up for British free speech. And obviously, as with political correctness, freedom of speech is being curtailed, on a pretty frequent basis. There was a story, I think it was a couple of years ago, the President's Club in London had a party, and there were some men trying to chat up women and invite them up to the hotel room, and Theresa May broke off from the World Economic Summit in Davos to say how this was outrageous and this was totally inappropriate, instead of standing up for British citizens' rights to free speech. She wanted to curtail it. When I was a young boy, the England football manager Glenn Hoddle made some comment about disabled people, and Tony Blair immediately came out and said he had to lose his job, instead of, again, standing up for his right to free speech and freedom of expression. British Prime Ministers, they don't usually bother with that. So freedom of speech has been thrown out. Freedom to protest has been totally violated. I've done a couple of videos on this, and Piers Corbyn, I think, has been a total star of trying to protest and got arrested. And any protesters that are arrested is unlawful in my view if they're protesting peacefully. Piers Corbyn being arrested for speaking at Speaker's Corner was one of the most outrageous things I've ever seen. Right to due process has been totally violated through this crisis because it depends on the presumption of innocent until proven guilty. And everyone put under house arrest has been denied that. No one has been proven to be unwell. Some people have been unwell, a lot of people haven't been unwell. I can speak for myself. I haven't been unhealthy for a very long time. I'm pretty much the healthiest person I know. I've been confined to house arrest, and not a single person from the government has taken me to court to prove that I'm unwell or that I'm a danger to other people by spreading the virus. Has not happened. Total denial of due process for me and millions of others. Freedom of assembly has been totally violated. The rights of British people to assemble, to do whatever they want to do. You know, I think a lot of people can understand that point. Freedom of association, there's been bans on who you can associate with. You can have cleaners over to your house, but you can't have relatives. And, you know, all sorts of other nonsense. Totally violates the freedom of association. Freedom of religious worship has been totally violated. Churches have been forced to close. Religious gatherings have been broken up by the police. It's a total violation of government authority and of civil liberties. And, you know, freedom from unlawful searches and seizures, you know, this track and trace stuff that Hancock's trying to put in, is totally unlawful. You cannot track people and trace them without just cause. And the government know this, and they're hoping to pull the wool over the eyes of our citizenry. And it's important we stand up and say absolutely not. There'll be no spying on our people. And, you know, anyone from the government that tries to do that will face, you know, criminal consequences. So I think, just finally, like I said at the beginning, we need a lot more dialogue and education with our people on what our civil liberties are, what the limits to government authority is, and you know, we need to update our documents, our Bill of Rights, to make sure it's really, really sharp and accurate and in line with the needs of the day. I think that it's important that more people do what I'm doing and speak up about this stuff. We've got to get ourselves educated on civil liberties and make sure they're enforced, because people that do not defend their freedoms do not deserve to retain them. And I think we've really reached a critical point in history now where we've got to stand up as the class of 2020, as it were, and start demanding, you know, more of our rights all of our rights are totally respected, and let's put some huge limits and criminal consequences on the government when they so brazenly try to take them away. So I hope you like this video. Please subscribe, and we'll look forward to talking with you soon.